Hello, I'm Mitchell McKinney, Dean of the University of Akron's Buchtel College of Arts and Sciences. As part of our monthly series, Dialogue with the Dean, I visit with members of the college's outstanding faculty to learn more about the research and creative activity that they're doing. Today, I'm talking with Dr. Mary Triece, Professor of Communication. Thanks so much for joining me, Dr. Triece, to discuss your very important scholarship. I'm amazed that within the past year you've had not one but 2 books published, and you've certainly been busy with your research. And both of those books include Memory Work, White Ignorance and Black Resistance in Popular Magazines from 1900 to 1910, and then also Radical Advocate, Ida B. Wells, and The Road to Race and Gender Justice. So first, let's focus on Ida B. Wells. And then for those listening who may not be familiar with Ida B. Wells, who was she?
Yeah, Ida B. Wells was a journalist, a public speaker, and an activist who spearheaded the anti-lynching crusade of the late 1800s, early 1900s. She widely published in mainstream white-owned magazines and newspapers as well as black-owned magazines, and she also self-published long pamphlets. Importantly, her decades-long activism laid a foundation for the century of struggle to get a federal bill, a federal anti-lynching bill passed. Finally, in 2022, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act.
Now, in Radical Advocate, you introduced the concept of radical embodied advocacy. Can you explain what that means and how you see it operating even in modern activism?
Yes, a radical embodied activist is a unique position different from other types of advocacy. It falls along the lines of what's called citizen journalism or participatory journalism, even the term intersectional journalism. So a radical embodied advocate is someone who occupies a marginalized position. Ida B. Wells was an African-American woman whose daily experiences of racism, sexism, etc., are shaped and informed by the very issues they're covering. And radical embodied advocates often have to use what we would call non-traditional rhetorical strategies in order to press specifically for systemic social change.
So from your work, we learned that Ida B. Wells faced direct threats and violence for her journalism.
Right.
How do you think that her courage and her rhetorical approach continue to shape how we view the role of journalists today, and especially women of color?
Yes, exactly. So there is something called journalism while black or writing while black. It's this idea that women of color who are journalists face unique challenges that other journalists, for instance, white men, don't face. They are often accused unfairly of bias in their coverage simply because they've experienced the issues they're covering, and they face harassment and threats in ways that Ida B. Wells did.
Now, in Memory Work, you discuss how white and black magazines were often in dialogue with each other in the early 1900s. So how so?
So these magazines operated kind of like social media platforms operate in our culture today. Magazines were a space where people debated, discussed, and could read about important social problems. So the time period I'm looking at, they were debating what they called the quote-unquote race question. What was the role of Black Americans in this new sort of society post-Reconstruction? And they dialogued because they had very different takes on the race question, with white magazines, and by white press I mean owned by white people and headed by white editors and white writers. They often took a nostalgic look at slavery. They whitewashed slavery, and they presented the issue of lynching, which rose to the fore post-Reconstruction, as a quote-unquote aberration, rather than, as it really was, a continuation of white violence from slavery through really what we now know as white violence in the 21st century. Black magazines, in contrast, pointedly called out history and the connections of slavery to lynching and white violence during that time. And Memory Work specifically explores how these different magazines culturally constructed memory. So memory is distinct from what we think of as sort of an accurate recollection. Socially constructed memories are strategic. There are strategic silences, strategic forgetting, and strategic whitewashing going on. In contrast, Black resistant memory called to the fore important memories and narratives that shape how we remember racism and how it continues to play out today.
So do you see parallels between the exchanges of the magazines in the early 1900s to today's conversations or silences in social media?
Absolutely. There's a direct and really kind of haunting parallel. We see it today in discussions over how to teach. We see it today in state mandates over what we can and can't talk about in our college and high school curricula, and how we may or may not talk about slavery, oppression, racism, etc. Those silencing, that strategic silencing, and also what is called quote unquote white ignorance, which is a deliberate refusal to acknowledge, a refusal to know, a refusal to bear witness. We see it very much today in mandates from executive orders to state legislation. And social media continues to play a role, a double-edged role, in that it gives a voice to people who have the hardware, the smartphones and so forth. But also, as we know, social media platforms create spaces to continue to foment hatred and racism and to spread disinformation.
So now the strategies found in the Black magazines and Ida B. Wells' rhetorical strategies that were used to challenge dominant narratives, what lessons can we learn today as we navigate a very polarized political and media environment?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is use all of the available means of persuasion, as Aristotle taught us, right? So Ida B. Wells published in all sorts of outlets, including turning to self-publication when mainstream outlets shut her down. Speak truth to power, even when it's scary. And importantly, if you occupy a position of relative privilege, that means if you are white, cisgender, etc., be an ally, listen, allow people in marginalized groups to voice and to lead, but be an ally. And also engage in, along with rhetorical strategies, public speaking, and traditional discourses and debate, use non-traditional and more confrontational tactics, as we've seen over the past month or so internationally. Speak out, join rallies, occupy public spaces, call attention to the issues.
Well, Dr. Triece, it's been fascinating hearing about your work. And again, congratulations on both of your books. And thanks for joining us and sharing on Dialogue with the Dean.
Thank you for having me.